Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Rylands Lunchtime Seminar Series. My name's Guida Armstrong, and I'm the Director of the John Rylands Research Institute at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing this seminar today. Our Rylands Online Lunchtime Seminar Series highlights the breadth and quality of our unique special collections and showcases world-class collections-based research activities. So today's session is coming to you from various rooms across the historic John Rylands Library in Deansgate and other rooms in Manchester. And as usual, we'll be showing some of the really outstanding artefacts of our collections and presenting new research on them. Today's seminar is going to be Zoom only, but I think you'll still get a fantastic sense of the objects. So our seminar today is on bookwork, extra illustration in the John Rylands Library, which will provide an introduction and hopefully definition of extra illustrated books in our holdings. Before I introduce our speakers, there's just a few things to mention. So the event is being recorded and it'll be edited and made available in due course on the John Rylands Library YouTube channel. Auto subtitles are available using your own settings. We're using the Zoom webinar format, so this means that your camera and microphone is disabled on entry. And at the end of the session, there'll be about 15 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to ask one, please can you add questions in the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. These will be then selected by me as the chair and conveyed to the panel. We should have time to take quite a few questions, and we're aiming to stop about 1:45 p.m. So without further preamble, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. They are Dr. Hannah Yip, who's a Leverhulme postdoctoral research fellow here at the Institute, and Dr. Elizabeth Gow, who is curator of manuscripts at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library. So Dr. Yip's research has been supported by the AHRC and a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship. She's published on a wide range of topics, from early modern loneliness to early modern sermons, in journals including the Journal of Ecclesiastical History and the Lancet Psychiatry. Further work is forthcoming in Milton Studies, and together with Ben Jackson, also of the JRRI, she's currently working on clerical lives in England and Wales, circa 1600 to 1800, which is contracted with Manchester University Press. For the John Rylands Library, she's curated a digital exhibition on extra illustrated early modern books, which she's going to talk about today. Presenting with Hannah is Dr. Elizabeth Gow, who's a manuscript curator and archivist at the University of Manchester Library. She's curated exhibitions related to Enriqueta Rylands and the history of the John Rylands Library, and published on Rylands' collecting, philanthropy and biography. In 2023, Elizabeth completed a PhD in museology at the Institute for Cultural Practices here at the university. Her thesis, Enriqueta Rylands, the public and private collecting of a nonconformist bibliophile, includes a chapter on Rylands' extra illustrated collects. So I'm hoping we're going to hear more about those today. So thank you both for coming and for talking to us, and over to you.
Thank you, Guida. I will share my screen. Is that good? Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly introduce our seminar before handing over to Hannah. So Hannah's going to answer that question that Guida asked, what is extra illustration? Then I'm going to talk a little bit introducing the extra illustrated books in the John Rylands Library and how they got here. Then I'm going to hand back to Hannah, who's going to talk about her amazing exhibition, which focuses on early modern extra illustrated books, before I'm coming back at the end to talk about Enriqueta Rylands' extra illustrated collects or prayer book. So over to you, Hannah.
Thanks very much, Guida and Elizabeth. So, as all book historians know, texts are never static objects, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the extra illustrated book. But what is extra illustration exactly? Extra illustration is the process whereby books in their published state are customised by readers and collectors, usually by means of incorporating materials such as prints, engravings and drawings. Extra illustrated books differ from scrapbooks in that the themes of the material added by the collector are dictated by the printed texts. These additional materials function as visual annotations to a text rather than mere decoration. The resulting artefacts reflect the taste, diligence, and means of the collector. Because of the price of inlaying and binding, it was an expensive hobby. The Reverend James Granger, Vicar of Shiplake, Oxfordshire, is credited with beginning the craze for extra illustration in the late 18th century. In 1769, he published a biographical history of England, which had taken him half a decade to compile. Granger's book, which contained no illustrations originally, combined biographies with lists of portraits, and readers began to paste portraits into their copies of Granger's text. This practice spread to other books, and this is why extra illustration is also known as grangerizing. This term was recorded in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1882, and it is notably the case that Granger himself never actually extra illustrated his books. He preferred instead to store his prints loose in portfolios. It was not only portraits which were used to embellish and extend books. Readers and collectors would also go on to augment their books with scenic views, maps, original watercolours, engravings, and woodcuts. As the fashion for grangerizing evolved, extra illustrators turned their hand towards theatre, topography, literature, in particular the work of Shakespeare and Dickens. Within the Rylands collection, there are many such extra illustrated works, but perhaps one of the most famous is this extra illustrated edition of the works of Shakespeare within the collection of George John, 2nd Earl Spencer, and more on the Spencer collection as this talk progresses. It's only really in the past 15 years or so that the extra illustrated book has been studied in detail by scholars. The title of our talk today, Bookwork, stems from Whitney Trettien's coining of the term as a description of the work carried out to transform a book and simultaneously the work done with books. In 2010, the Folger Shakespeare Library curated an exhibition extending the book, The Art of Extra Illustration, which centred on the numerous possibilities that Shakespeare's texts offered for extra illustrators, principally in the 19th century. Lucy Peltz's 2017 book, Facing the Text, explores the practice of extra illustration within the context of larger scholarly discussions on marginalia, book use, and private libraries. Last year, Julie Park and Adam Smythe organised a conference on the theme of extra illustration, focusing not only on the heyday period of the 18th and 19th centuries, but also considering global perspectives. Building upon his considerable scholarship on Elizabethan Catholic print and scribal production, Earl Havens is currently investigating the underground book culture of Elizabethan England, with a particular focus on extra illustrated Catholic books compiled by priests and lay people alike. And you can look up this talk that he gave earlier this year on the Society of Antiquaries' YouTube channel. Scholars have been fascinated by the concept that extra illustration is a balance of destruction and creativity. The binding is removed from the leaves become separated from one another, the book is rebound to accommodate its increased thickness, and the volume is transformed. For these collectors, the book could never be finished or complete. There would always be possibilities to procure further material to paste into these texts. Indeed, it could turn into a rather addictive hobby, or, as the bibliographer Thomas Frognall Dibdin described it in 1809, a pestiferous malady. Indeed, the Reverend James Granger himself predicted that the very practice that he had started might get out of hand. In a letter written on the 30th of December 1769, the year he published his biographical history of England, he referred to iconomania as a new disease that prevailed much in London, one symptom of it being the delight in the maiming of old books. Scholars have also been interested in the ways that the act of supplementation might distract from reading the text itself, especially when considering the specific placement of images. Referring to this Rylands extra illustrated copy of Shakespeare that I mentioned earlier as a key source text, Louisa Calais has paid particular attention to the displacement of frontispieces. She observes that instead of mediating the entrance to the text and guiding the reader into it, when placed in the middle of the book, they instead interrupt the textual continuum, dismantling the reading experience and disrupting the continuity of the work. At the Rylands, there are numerous such examples of displaced frontispieces within extra illustrated books, ranging from the 17th century to the 19th century, from Mazarinades dating from the time of Louis XIV, containing portraits of key political figures from Le Fronde, to the memoirs of the 19th century fencing master Henry Angelo, containing numerous portraits, caricatures, and theatrical posters. I will now hand over to Elizabeth, who will explore the extensive collection of extra illustrated books in the John Rylands Library.
Thank you, Hannah. So I'm going to talk a bit about how these books got here. So the John Rylands Library was founded by Enriqueta Rylands in memory of her husband, John Rylands, who died in 1888, leaving her in charge of an immense fortune. She decided to found a library in his memory, commissioning the architect Basil Champneys and employing an agent to acquire books. Her earliest acquisitions were modern reference works on a variety of subjects. Acquisitions of rare books and manuscripts began in January 1891, triggered by her decision to build a collection of English Bibles. A few months later, in April 1891, at the sale of the aristocratic Lakeland Library, Rylands bought two notable grangerized books. She was participating on what was called a revival in the mania for buying extra illustrated books in the 1890s. In this letter from her book agent, J. Arnold Green, the son of a Baptist minister, he does his best to describe these unique artifacts, explaining about the extensive illustrations, which included engravings and watercolor drawings. He says, "The descriptions enclosed only convey a moderate idea of their beauty and historical value," and goes on to say that it would be 1,000 pities for such books to be buried again in a private library. So he's seeing them both as a sort of beautiful treasure, but also as a research resource. So these are the descriptions. I'm sorry, this is just a snap from my phone, but they're the descriptions that the book agent sent to Enriqueta. And as well as the printed descriptions from the auction catalogue, he's drawn what they look like. So you've got at the top, Rappin's History of England, which was originally 5 volumes, but it's now 21. And they were illustrated by Taylor Coombe. The second item is Pennant's Account of London, in a more modest 6 volumes, but they are large volumes. And this is the image that was on the poster, but it's an opening from Pennant's Account of London, which is one of these sort of topographical accounts, but it's been illustrated, as you'll see, with portraits. There's also a tortoise, because the text talks about someone owning a very long-lived tortoise. But other pages have maps and plans and drawings of people and places and all sorts of things. In a later letter, Green tells Rylands that he is having lists of the illustrations drawn up to be bound up in the volumes. So these volumes had lots of images in, but there wasn't a simple list of what they were. So he had these lists drawn up, which are handwritten lists, which have been bound in. He says that the Rappin, which Rylands paid £135 for, is actually worth at least 300. Both acquisitions were in the John Rylands Library when it opened in 1900, but others Rylands retained in her private library at Longford Hall until her death in 1908. The Spencer collection, a large and important private library that Rylands bought in 1892, also contained, as we've seen, extra illustrated books. Some are grand and important, like the Stevens Shakespeare. Others are relatively modest. Although the John Rylands Library as an institution didn't systematically collect extra illustrated books, they were perceived as luxury objects usually rather than research ones. More have been added over the years. In the early 20th century, a list was made by one of the library assistants, Thomas Murgatroyd. He identified about 45, and somebody later helpfully added the accession numbers so we can actually work out what they are. This page just gives you a bit of an idea of the sorts of things and what happened to them. So there's Ramses the Gentle Shepherd, which was a sort of poetic work, which has got a few inserted views, but also some manuscript verse and drawings. And because of the manuscript verse, this has actually been treated as an English manuscript, so it's catalogued with those. The wrap-in, which we've seen before in 21 volumes, now we know it contains 3,159 portraits. This stayed in the John Rylands Library print collections, but somehow it fell off the catalogue. And a few weeks ago, my colleagues in the metadata team did a sterling job of putting it back in the catalogue. So we now at least have some record that this book exists. Stephen Shakespeare is there again, which it also has a reference to Edis Althorpiani, where Dibdin, who Hannah mentioned, writes about this special work. And then the last item is something called Sheridania. I don't know how you pronounce it. Sheridaniana, anecdotes of the life of R.B. Sheridan, who was a dramatist. That came with a collection of dramatical works in the early 1900s. It is included in the printed book catalogue, but there's no clue in that catalogue that it's an extra illustrated book. So since Murgatroyd wrote his list, our current librarian, Julie Ramwell, has added to the list, although our current knowledge of the collection certainly isn't complete. We know of about 80 titles comprising over 350 volumes containing over 12,000 illustrations. These are dispersed, as I said, most of them are with the print collections, but some with the manuscripts. Lucy Peltz, in her seminal work, only covers 7 of them. They're also not easy to find in library search. The bulk come from the 1780s to the 1830s, the heyday of grangerization, but there are important examples showing a longer and broader history from the 1560s through to the 1930s. We're going to have a bit more of a look at these chronological borderlands. Hannah's going to introduce the early modern period before we circle back to Rylands, who not only bought grangerized books, but was inspired to make one.
Right, yes, great. So I thought I would provide a brief introduction to my digital exhibition, which launched 4 months ago. I first encountered extra illustrated early modern books in the Rylands as a visiting early career research fellow 4 years ago. Having always been interested in marginalia, I was intrigued to discover that these early modern books, annotated and embedded with visual and textual material over many years, and in some cases over centuries, were given a new lease of life long after their original publication date. Take, for example, this copy of the 1567 edition of Tottle's Miscellany, the first printed anthology of vernacular verse in England that originally did not contain any illustrations. The poems were principally composed by Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and Sir Thomas Wyatt, who's credited with popularising and anglicising the Petrarchan sonnet. It's a shame that I can't physically show you this volume, but it is an octavo, so a really rather small book, which, if you imagine, stands in stark contrast to the vast extra illustrated folios of the late 18th and 19th centuries, popularised by the Reverend James Granger's associates. This particular copy of Tottle's Miscellany belonged to George John, 2nd Earl Spencer. The Spencer collection was one of the greatest private libraries in Europe in the 19th century. By 1834, his collection consisted of upwards of 40,000 volumes. And we are lucky enough to get an insight into the process of extra illustration by virtue of a note that is enclosed within this copy of Tottle's Miscellany. The note describes a wooden print portrait by Hans Holbein of Sir Thomas Wyatt, conjectured to have been reproduced by the print seller John Thane, who sold the print for 7 shillings and 6pence, considerably cheaper than an original Holbein, which would have cost 5 guineas. In any case, it was not Thane who produced the print. It was the cleric and antiquary Michael Tyson, but we can conclude that the print had been purchased some time before John Thane's death in 1818, and we thus have some insight into when this copy of Tottle's Miscellany was extra illustrated. I think the next slide contains a picture of this print. Yes, this is the one. This was the print created by Michael Tyson, not by John Thane, after Hans Holbein. And the main work I'd like to talk about within my exhibition is another fascinating book within the Spencer collection. Again, it's a modest little volume, being only a quarto, and it's a copy of John Donne's poetry, actually the first printed edition of Donne's collected poetry published posthumously in 1633. And as many of you might know, most of Donne's work circulated only in manuscript during his lifetime. Like Tottle's Miscellany, it was not originally published with illustrations. Yet, this copy contains 7 portraits, carefully chosen to illustrate the subjects of Donne's poetry and Donne himself. I won't have time to explore each of the 7 portraits today, so I will focus exclusively on the portraits of Donne. The first portrait, which you saw back there, faces the title page and was engraved by William Marshall after a now lost miniature, possibly executed by Nicholas Hilliard. It first appeared as the frontispiece to the 1635 edition of Donne's poems. It is as if a kind of retrospective continuity is being constructed here, with the collector wanting to bring the visual elements or possibly improvements of the later edition back to the earlier edition. As Sarah Howe put it, this portrait lent the second, smaller format of the 1635 an aura of Donne's resurrected presence. The second portrait in this volume, representing Donne in his shroud, with a Latin epigraph translating as "May this shroud of the body be the shroud of the soul, the shroud of Jesus," is further proof, if needed, that Donne's portraits had been chosen carefully to accompany certain poems in this copy. This particular portrait was executed by Martin Druzout. Like the previous one, it had also been used originally to illustrate a posthumous work by Donne, in this case, Donne's final sermon, published as Death's Duel in 1632. The poem it accompanies in this copy, Hexastichon Bibliopolae, was composed by the printer John Marriott. As Elizabeth Chakafi notes, Marriott's poem had acted as a textual substitute for Donne's final portrait in the 1633 edition of Donne's poems. If you look at the next slide, yes, we'll be able to just see it in a little bit more detail. And here, what the extra illustrator has done has essentially reinstated that visual imagination of Donne in his shroud. And the third portrait of Donne is used to preface his satires, which were composed in the early 1590s. The satires were inspired by Persius, Juvenal, and Horace, and it is fitting that it was this particular portrait, engraved after a painting dating from 1620, that was chosen as the makeshift frontispiece to them, owing to the classical drapery and circular format redolent of medallion reliefs of classical antiquity. This was not the contemplative Donne of the final portrait explored previously, but Donne during his Lincoln Inn's days, before his election as Dean of St. Paul's. I mentioned earlier that the works of Shakespeare and Dickens proved to be popular choices for extra illustrators. Was this the case for Donne as well? The answer is not especially, meaning that the Rylands copy is a particularly valuable one. It should be noted, however, that Isaac Walton's Lives, a collection of biographical essays about English clergymen and scholars, including Donne, was unsurprisingly a prime candidate for extra illustration. This is a catalogue description of the collection of one David Addy of New York. Note in particular the description that Walton's works have been most luxuriously extra illustrated with utter disregard to expense, particular highlighted plates being done in his shroud and the portraits that originally prefaced the 1635 edition of Donne's poems. The catalogue description further notes that this copy was no doubt the finest extra illustrated Walton in the country, costing several $1,000s to build up. The next copy is this one. So it's currently on sale at Peter Harrington in London, and it contains a large selection of hand-coloured portraits. No doubt there are modern editions of Donne's poetry out there that have been supplemented with portraits and perhaps even drawings, whether by collectors, academics, students, or enthusiasts of his work. No doubt these 21st century individuals will have seen the potential within Donne's writings for visual embellishment and expansion, as George John, 2nd Earl Spencer, did 2 centuries ago. Over to Elizabeth now to discuss Enriqueta Rylands, who acquired the Spencer collection in 1892.
Thanks, Hannah. So, like other wealthy bibliophiles, Enriqueta Rylands was inspired and influenced by the examples in her possession. But her own work speaks to this long and diverse history of religious extra illustration, from small books of devotion to massive grangerized Bibles. So extra illustration is a response to both the contents and the materiality of books. This work is built around the Book of Common Prayer. This might come as a surprise to people who know Rylands as a Protestant nonconformist. It isn't just an Anglican text. It was a book that was integral to the power and prestige of the state religion and the exclusion of nonconformists who rejected it, including John Rylands. The book, which was originally a tiny book, has been expertly bound in decorated leather covers with inserts carefully inlaid into handmade Whatman paper. It follows elite practice, but it's also unconventional. Critics would have frowned on that tiny page set in ultra-wide margins. They would have also frowned on this, which is an original Cranach print of the a woodcut of the rest on the flight into Egypt, which has been folded to fit in the volumes. So these 9 volumes on the shelf show that it was a substantial project, though not as large as the 45-volume Boyer Bible in Bolton Library. These 9 volumes from Advent, Christmas, Epiphany follow the church calendar, but apparently missing Easter, Ascension, and other festivals. We'll come back to those. Within the uniform bindings, you can open them up to find all sorts of things, from maps and woodcuts to photographs and colour lithography. This is one of my favourites. It's a panorama of Jerusalem, which was so big that it had to be folded, and you have to sort of fold it out to see it. We also have a frontispiece, which possibly disrupts the text, but actually it comes in before. It's almost like a preface, so it is opposite the title page. And it's one of these architectural frontispieces with a door through which you enter into this new world. So as Whitney Trettien argues, bookwork, the material reconfiguration of books, changes their meaning and value. Although Rylands extended one small book into 9 volumes, she only included part of it, the collects, epistles, and gospels, which were readings from the Bible preceded by brief prayers or collects. This is a typical page which shows 4 images illustrating the first Sunday in Advent. It has 2 illustrations of Jesus entering the Jerusalem on an ass, and 2 illustrating keywords, which were doves and coins. So the text just mentions doves, therefore you put a picture in it. Really, although she was illustrating the prayer book, the text that she was illustrating was the Bible. But the prayer book was a way of doing that in a more concise and organized way. The images don't just function as pretty pictures, but as sort of imaginative ways into the text. There's a sort of interpretation of the Bible. And so Hannah introduced those terms, grangerization and extra illustration. But in the 1880s, a critic coined another term called privately illustrated, which denotes a more individualist visual response to a book, usually a narrative text. And this is really what these Bible illustrators were doing. Lucy Pelt set a standard for describing extra illustrated books, identifying compilations by the name of the extra illustrator and a short form of the title, and dating the extra illustration by the latest insert. This is the entry in the library catalogue, which doesn't really give much to go on. Murgatroyd included the volumes in his list, so they are identified as being extra illustrated, and you get a clue in the middle of this where it says physical description plates. That goes to say there are some extra pictures in this, but it doesn't really say anything about them. It also doesn't link these volumes to Enriqueta Rylands. To be fair, she didn't assert her authorship, as some of her contemporaries did, through an extra title page. The attribution to her rests on extraneous material. This is my snapshot of a list of books at Longford Hall, Rylands' home, in 1908, and it records the 9 volumes shelved in the billiard room, but also notes 19 parcels of engravings, etc., to finish the illustrating of this work. This unbound material lay forgotten until a few years ago, when one of the collection's assistants, Claire Baker, was sorting through some drawers of unidentified prints. I walked past and poked my nose in. The parcels were wrapped in brown paper, labelled Biblical and Other Illustrations, intended for the completion of the Grangerized Book of Common Prayer from Mrs. Rylands. It was actually these folders that led to the discovery of the volumes rather than the other way round. Containing more than 3,000 images, these folders tripled the size of the assemblage. If completed, the set would have comprised at least 23 volumes. I've just shown you one of these folders, which gives an idea of the material processes involved. The acquisition of images, which would have to be trimmed, arranged, and mounted into pages before the pages could be sewn together and sent to the binder. This image of the top of the pile is a photographic reproduction of a painting showing Mary and Martha attending to Jesus. The image is annotated with a Bible quote that clearly meant something to Rylands. It says, "Not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." In this project, Rylands combined her religious belief with her love of books, and her practical approach. She was definitely a doer as much as a thinker, with a growing interest in art. She left us with a wonderful, if challenging, legacy. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was absolutely fantastic. I took loads of notes and I have a million questions, although I will obviously allow other people to ask questions as well. If you'd like to put your questions, viewers, in the Q&A box, I can relay them to the presenters. But I wondered if I could actually hog your attention first. I was really, obviously, I'm a book historian as well, and I'm really interested in the material object. I'm really interested in surface and support. And you've sort of shown us the folders. You've given us this kind of really tantalizing view of how she might have made these books and how other people have made them. But how did people actually, what ways are the images integrated with the text? I mean, I was thinking, is it ever done in the form? Is it ever done with the paper pulp? I've spoken to conservators who might make a new piece of paper and actually float in an old piece of paper, and if that's one of the, or is it pasted in, or is it some of them are dipped in?
So the way that Enriqueta did it, which was the sort of prestigious way, is that you interleave with extra paper, and then that paper is margined to fit the image in. So the image isn't pasted onto the paper, it's sort of inlaid into it.
So put out and put into the space.
Yes.
Like a kind of marquetry kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. And from when grangerization became really popular, some books were actually published in editions to make this easier. So you had things published which were large, so they could fit plates in, but they also had extra blank pages. But the little prayer book was tiny and not designed for that purpose.
I mean, because I think so. It's basically you've got already made paper or supports which come together. Because I think you can actually, you can kind of, because paper is a pulp, you can put things in there as well, and I think that would be really interesting. But I don't know if you come across anything like that, Hannah.
Not as well. Certainly, it wasn't the case that the books would be specially designed for extra illustration in the same way that Elizabeth's material might have been. In my experience, it totally varies. So sometimes they would just be simply pasted in. Sometimes even painted on. That there's the really fantastic one in my exhibition where someone has just painted opposite the title page, and then other times it would be inlaid as well. So it's a whole variety when it comes to early modern books. That's certainly what I found.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really I feel a paper making project coming on actually. But it's fantastically interesting. I didn't really know about this phenomenon, so I'm gonna, I knew about your exhibition, so I'm gonna definitely check it out more. We have a question in the Q&A, but we can take more, everybody. This is a question from somebody called Finch Collins, who says, in my experience, library cataloguing systems and discovery layers don't always handle complex print and manuscript items, like extra illustrated copies very well. So what steps are the curatorial and metadata teams taking to rediscover, surface and share extra illustrated books in the Rylands collections? And then, have you encountered barriers to sharing these items with the broader research community and public when they're discovered? So, who
Hannah,
first?
Hannah, do you want to start with the exhibition?
Yes, so I think that the Rylands do have a hand list of extra illustrated books, don't they? But I wasn't actually aware of that until after I compiled the exhibition, which was interesting. And it was good that I didn't miss anything out that was too important, at least for my subject area as well. But yeah, I totally agree with the question. It's one I've wanted to ask many times, and it reminds me of this article that was published some time ago by Bill Sherman and Heather Wolfe, where they're talking about it in relation to marginalia studies, where manuscripts and printed books are treated as distinct categories, and they're actually studied in separate rooms at Cambridge University Library. And it's a bit annoying for people who want to study the interaction between both, because they have to keep going between the rooms. And Elizabeth mentioned earlier there's that one object at the Rylands that has been categorized as a manuscript owing to the fact that it contains manuscript verse, even though it is a printed book. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that sometimes as these types of artifacts fall between the cracks, it must be difficult for curatorial teams to categorize them and make them sort of better known and searchable. So perhaps Elizabeth might want to take over from here.
Yeah, I mean, I think although I'm a manuscript curator, so only one of those falls within my remit, and the manuscript catalogue has a bit more space for the sort of detail and contextual information that you might want. I think that they are a big challenge because they sort of fall between these sort of professional camps. And really, if you want a proper catalogue which is searchable, you need both a print curator, a visual art curator, and someone who understands collecting practices and the sort of material construction of them. And because they haven't until recently been considered as research objects, it's difficult to put in the investment that they really require. And for something where you've got a really high status one, where the individual engravings are regarded by art historians as important, they might want that catalogued. But for something like Enriqueta's, where the individual things are mostly from modern printed books and they're not important as works of art, I don't think anyone could justify individually cataloguing all the images. But I do think that we could be better about flagging which things are extra illustrated. And I'm pretty sure that there are things in your exhibition which aren't flagged in the lists that are sort of behind the scenes in the Rylands. I think there'll be ever expanding lists, which is exciting, but yeah.
I mean, it's so interesting to think about it in those ways. And I was thinking, what kind of catalogues are you talking about? So you've got like a hand list, or you've got like, Alma or whatever, the library catalogue. I was just thinking about MDC, and, actually TEI has got such
Yeah, I mean, and
powerful guidelines about how you do manuscripts and how you do printed books. So,
although TEI is slightly less good for the visual material,
oh yeah, well,
but I mean, I know that we've put very complicated scrapbooks into MDC, and I think it would work with extra illustrated books quite well. I do think, I mean, one of the problems with them is that it's really hard to show what they're like without having the thing out in front of you and being able to turn the pages and see how it actually works, how you interact with it. So it's difficult to put in physical exhibitions, and this is one of the glorious things about the digital exhibition, that it does give you a way into seeing these objects in the round. So not just as a book or just as a collection of images, but as this sort of multifaceted thing and how it works.
yeah, I'm just thinking you could actually put a video in MDC on the metadata side as well. So you've got that kind of three-dimensionality.
Well,
And also, I mean, IIIF could pull in the other books from which the bits are extracted. I mean, there are so many things to do about this. Maybe we should have a competition.
we are planning there's going to be an exhibition about Enriqueta's private library next year, and we're planning to do a digital resource about her extra illustrated collects, which might include a video, and also I'm hoping to get one of the conservators to show how inlaying works.
Excellent. Well, I can show how paper inlaying works as well. So maybe we all need to reconvene in a year and a half's time to report on that on our next seminar series. So I think we're probably coming to the end of our time actually. But thank you to the person that put the questions in. And thank you to you both and everybody else who's worked on these things as well. It's been absolutely epic and such a good way to show the kind of variety and the kind of extent and of our amazing collections and the kind of research questions that they pose. So our next seminar will be happening in 2 weeks' time. So I would like to invite everybody who's here for this one to come back for that one, including the speakers. So I'd like to thank you both again. I'd like to thank the tech team who are in all of the rooms around the building. I'll give you the name of the next seminar because I forgot to do that. So the seminar is called Student Voices in the Archives with Professor Sue Heath from the School of Social Sciences and Dr. Grant Collier. And that'll be on Thursday, the 11th of December from 1 to 2 p.m. online again. So thank you all very much, and hopefully I'll see you all in a couple of weeks.